Hey guys, I wanted to do this small video as I have not seen any VR specific benchmarks of the new 2080 RTX cards. Now the scope of this video is very specific, and what I mean by that is I concentrated only on VR performance in sim racing titles. The methodology for these tests was very simple. All I wanted to see was how the new 2080 Ti card compares versus my outgoing 1080 Ti card in various sim racing titles, specifically in VR. To keep things on a level playing field, I used the same graphic settings in games for both cards and recorded the frames per second as well as the smoothness of play. To start off with a couple synthetic benchmarks. It's no surprise that 2080 Ti seems to be a lot faster than the 1080 Ti. What did surprise me though, it's how much faster the synthetic VR benchmark seems to be on the 2080 Ti. So I concentrated on three titles in this review: Assetto Corsa, Dirt Rally, and Iracing. Supersampling settings were set through Oculus Trade Tool, and the first title to look at is Assetto Corsa. So here is Assetto Corsa with Supersampling at 1.5, with 10 cars on track, and with Assetto by Night mod. I normally have to run this with ASW set to 45 or locked to 45 for smooth gameplay. And as you can see in this case, the frames per second do jump around all over the place depending on how crowded the field gets. Now these are the exact same settings with a 2080 Ti card. As you can see, it pretty much maintains a 90 frames per second throughout the whole clip. Now this is some footage of the 2080 Ti card with Assetto Corsa max setting, meaning everything in the Content Manager graphics setting has been maxed out. Now with the 1080 Ti card, I would not be able to play with this many cars on track, and even with ASW locked to 45, it would still not be playable. Now as a final test, I wanted to see what would happen if I increase Supersampling to 2.0 while at the same time leaving the settings at the initial Assetto Corsa settings, so not the full max. As you can see, the frames are jumping a little bit, but they're still hanging around that 90 frame per second mark. So I think a couple adjustments in the graphic settings, and I think you can run it at 2.0 smoothly with a 2080 card. So just a final note on the Assetto Corsa testing. I did test with Assetto Corsa by night because I did want to add that extra stress on the GPU to see which card actually copes better in VR. Next, I tested Dirt Rally, and with Dirt Rally I took a similar approach to Assetto Corsa, meaning I set up the graphic settings in a way that I could play both the 1080 Ti and the 2080 Ti card on same settings. Now with Supersampling on 1.7, I normally have to play Dirt Rally at ASW lock to 45 frames with a 1080 Ti card. In this case, I disabled ASW completely so we could see what both cards will do at Supersampling 1.7 and same graphic setting. So as you can see in Dirt Rally with Supersampling on 1.7 and the 1080 Ti card, which is overclocked to just over 2000 megahertz, the frames do bounce around a little bit, and this is what I consider medium settings. So they're really custom settings, but they're more on the medium side. And this is where I meant to, I have to play with ASW locked to 45 frames, and then it's perfectly playable for me.
Crest jump, right 6 over crest jump, times 5 long, 40. bump, and caution middle over big jump, and left 6 100, right 6 over crest 80 through dip, caution crest jump maybe, left 6 60 turn square right, don't cut. Into right 5 long past junction, tightens 4, 40, left 5 long over bump, tightens 120. Care line over jump, 60, left 5 over crest, jump maybe, don't cut, 80, right 5 tightens 4 over crest, don't cut, 40.
Now, with the same settings on the 2080 Ti card with super sampling at 1.7, same as before, you can see that the frames are pretty much steady at 90 frames per second. So this is a huge improvement for me, as I don't have to lock ASW to 45. I can play at the native 90 frames per second. So this clearly shows that 2080 Ti card is managing a lot better in VR than the 1080 was. As a final test in Dirt Rally, I cranked up the graphic settings to Ultra and gave it a go on the 2080 Ti card. And as you can see, it pretty much maintains 90 frames per second. Now this would be impossible on the 1080 Ti card. Even with ASW locked to 45 frames per second, the game was just not playable. So a huge win for the 2080 Ti card in this respect. Final sim that I tested is Iracing. So for Iracing, similar approach to the previous two, meaning setting up the graphics so I could get 90 frames per second on the 1080 Ti with super sampling at 1.7. So as you can see, with what I consider medium settings for Iracing with super sampling at 1.7, the 1080 Ti seems to be maintaining 90 frames per second. So it looks pretty good. So the next test for Iracing, I left Supersampling on 1.7, but I cranked all the graphics settings to max and tried it out on the 1080 Ti. So as you can see, with the max settings, the frames are jumping all over the place, going as low as 45 frames per second. So to actually get a smooth drive out of this setting, I would probably have to lock ASW to 45 frames per second. So you can see that the 1080 Ti is struggling with the max settings in Iracing. So for the final test in Iracing, I used the same settings I used for the 1080 Ti on the 2080 Ti. As you can see, with the max settings in Iracing and Supersampling at 1.7, the 2080 Ti has no problems maintaining 90 frames per second. So clearly a big difference between the 1080 Ti and 2080 Ti when it comes to VR performance in Iracing. So what's the conclusion? Well, based on my testing in all three sims in VR, the 2080 Ti card is just a powerhouse. In comparison to the 1080 Ti, which does well on usually medium settings, the 2080 Ti powers through the max settings for all three sims. Now I haven't tried it in a lot of the other sims which I have, which I will do at some point, but I wanted to try these three specifically as they're all a little bit different. And in all three cases, the 2080 Ti comes out on top. Maxed out settings without having to resort to locking ASW to 45 frames per second, for example, is a big plus. So for me, I think it was a good investment. I mean, I spent a lot of money on the sim back there. You know, I almost exclusively play in VR now, so those three monitors will probably have to go at some point. With the motion sim, it's just another level. So to be able to play at max settings for almost every sim, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be every sim, it's a big plus. So for me, I highly recommend it. Again, waiting for my water cooling setup, so I'm sure I can push it a little bit more once that gets here. So the performance will improve even more. So for me, it's a big plus. I highly recommend it. If you get a chance to pick one up, especially if you're invested in the hobby like I am, it's a good buy. Okay, cheers guys.